All right, so we're live. So first of all, thanks. Thanks for being here, albeit virtually. We're all familiar with certainly the first few chapters of this study, and so my intention is to kind of really fly through that and spend the bulk of this time really on the crux of the study, primarily chapters 4 and 5. So the first chapter really set the stage in terms of why is language valuable within a holistic educational context. Language is our identity. It's the window into our identity, but it's also what we find is that it's the window that allows us to see the world outside a little bit differently. So again, really fundamental aspect of who we are as human beings. And then that kind of leads us into the problem that it kind of is the impetus for this study. And that is, for about the last 40 years, the literature in second language acquisition research has pretty firmly established the principles and the nature of second language acquisition. And I used Krashen's 5 hypotheses that are very widely known in the field to really establish that. However, the reality of the classroom is markedly different. And I was leveraging Burke's work in terms of what do modern second language classrooms in the United States look like. And she identified specific rituals and beliefs that are ingrained there within. Grammar practice being one of them, explicit grammar teaching, the use of English to teach grammar and to drill grammar, the use of translation. And so the reality of what's going on in our classrooms demonstrates a pretty broad disconnect between what we know about second language acquisition theories and principles and the nature there within. Now, this is not new, I should say, and our very own Ignatius of Loyola some 500 years ago called this out, or he said grammar instruction is the medieval approach. And so understanding this problem, I think we also need to grapple with the fact that perhaps its legacy may be one of the biggest obstacles of change. And so this study, among other things, wanted to investigate that. And so primarily the research question that guided this study was to ask the question of what is the relationship between what teachers value as important or as influential in their teaching practices or on their teaching practices on one hand, and then what is their value of grammar instruction on the other. And the idea is to see if we can find relationships between these influential factors and their value of explicit grammar instruction, so that we could potentially identify variables that we could say, hey, listen, let's distance ourselves from these variables, or perhaps let's introduce these variables in the void, so that together we can kind of continue to push the field of second language acquisition or second language teaching forward into a more communicative space. In my review of the literature, I identified 10 potential variables that could be influential on language teachers in their practice. And we're using, obviously, the value of explicit grammar instruction as the dependent variable. So those are the values that we're going to be using to identify relationships there within. We had discussed before, the research design here is utilized as a one-shot pre-experimental case study design. I blended different facets of survey instruments in order to use that survey instrument to identify the variable, the construct values that I discussed. And one of the things, so accessing the student participants is about the same as we had discussed before. I was using a purposive sampling method. In particular, I was really leveraging a subset of purposive sampling known as maximum variation sampling. The idea there being that I really wanted to make sure that I got the perspectives of the wide range of philosophical and pedagogical beliefs within the field of second language teaching. I wanted to make sure that they were all represented, because I think that having them there would strengthen the correlational relationships and certainly strengthen the validity of the study as a whole. Though the one access point that was a little bit different than when we had discussed during the proposal defense was the direct invitation to the K through 12 curriculum leaders. And when we talk about limitations, I'll discuss why that was that was an additional step that was warranted. So there is a wide range of biodemographic information that I was able to collect based on the study participants. It's too much for this segment right here. And so what I want to do is really just kind of show you the average participant. And I want to give you means and modes that might give you a sense of who is the average participant that participated in the study. So of the 615 eligible participants that I was able to use for the study, primarily female, about 45 years old. They primarily learned the target language in school, in a school setting. They value both communication and accuracy just about equally. The sample that I used tended to skew slightly toward the communicative side, but nonetheless, kind of right there in the middle. They teach primarily novice and intermediate students. They teach in a high school setting. They teach Spanish primarily, although one of the cool things about the study is just the mountain of different languages that are taught. I mean, it's a really neat characteristic for the field in general. Pennsylvania was where the primary or the average participant resides. You can see in this figure right here a really decent overview of where the study participants come from. You see Pennsylvania very strongly represented. It's very possible that's due to some researcher bias, given my access to teachers in Pennsylvania. But nonetheless, you really do see a nice variety in terms of the density of participants in different states. Lastly, these teachers, although they learn the target language primarily in a classroom setting, on average, they spent more than 2 years immersed in target language communities. And then lastly, these participants are members of multiple professional learning groups. And again, this is something that we can discuss a little bit later on in terms of some of the limitations of the study. The information collected was, as we had discussed, IRB approval first. There was a very brief pilot study phase, and then that lasted into the full study implementation that was initially scheduled for a 1-month window and then extended by another month to ensure that we could fill in some of those pockets that weren't represented. Again, kind of aligning with that maximum variation sampling strategy. The information was analyzed basically in these 3 steps. So the first thing that I wanted to do was conduct some reliability testing to ensure that this is a valid instrument. From there, the preparatory analyses allowed me to kind of get into some of the descriptive statistics to understand the participants, to understand these variables a little bit further. And then lastly, to really answer the research question, that's when we jumped into the good stuff, the inferential statistics, and that's where we see the correlations, the multiple regression analysis, and as well as the analysis of variance. We did 2 of those to shed some light on the situation here. So to begin, the first thing that I did with the dependent variable is I wanted to run a factor analysis. As I expected, all 6 items loaded into a single factor. That's a great sign for the dependent variable because we all wanted it to speak to the same construct. Now that being said, Dr. Wang and I took a look at some of the items and we identified that item 15 was qualitatively different than the rest, and we thought that it might be a good idea to eliminate that from the source. And that brought the Cronbach's alpha score from 0.899 to 0.903. At that point, I thought that it may be a good idea just to maximize the Cronbach's alpha score by eliminating item 17 as well, which does have a qualitatively different tweak to it as well. And that really, again, maximized the Cronbach's alpha score to a 0.906. And from that, I was able to run into the inferential statistics. Now, before getting there, just to kind of give you an idea, these were the means of those individual items for the dependent variable. What this shows me more than anything else, and if you kind of look at these mean averages, they're about in the same range, which again goes to show you that they are showing more or less the same construct. The standard deviations as well, demonstrating a relatively normal distribution. So again, all of that is stuff that we want to see. Looking toward the independent variable side, this here just shows you the extent to which teachers perceive these variables as influential. You can see, for example, the sense of plausibility, this idea that teachers just kind of know generally what works, this intuitive sense. This is in fact the highest rated as the most influential for teachers. Textbooks, on the other end, ironically, are rated as the least influential, but still in that somewhat influential range. And everything really falls kind of in between this somewhat influential to influencing completely. So it goes to show you that there is a variety of different variables that exist out there that are influencing our teachers and how they go about teaching. This, again, kind of the same information, but what you're seeing here, again, if you look at these standard deviations, showing you, again, a relatively normal distribution for each of these variables. Again, a good sign that we really can be using these descriptive statistics for reliable analysis. There was one of the independent variables, self-efficacy, did not use the same 10-point scale as the other 9. Instead, I borrowed a scale for self-efficacy that already existed, very widely used within the field of education generally, but in the niche field of second language acquisition as well. And what we see here, the total self-efficacy score with an average of 89.38, that if you were to equate that to that 10-point scale, it basically means like a 7-ish. So kind of right in line with those other variables as well. I wanted to also take a look, because there's so many variables. So I wanted to conduct a factor analysis as well to see how these variables group together. They loaded into three distinct factors, explaining about 52.5% of the variance of the dependent variable. Running our Cronbach's alpha on these variables, you see that the Cronbach alpha score is a 0.44, significantly lower than our dependent variable. However, to be expected, given the wide range of different variables. And so while that Cronbach's alpha is lower, it's acceptable and it's expected. So I found that to be fine. All right, so here's where we get into the good stuff. This is where we're really going to answer the question that we identified in the beginning. So the first thing that we wanted to do was see if these variables correlated to the total grammar. So you see that number 1, that's our dependent variable. Now there's a lot of information here, and I just want to draw your attention really to this first column, because that's going to tell us how these other 10 variables relate. The first thing that we can see is we can take a look at these positive correlations. Now, when we see a positive correlation, what that's telling us is that as a participant in the study says that their value of grammar increases, so too does the value of these variables. And so we're seeing past learner experiences increasing the relationship of the value of grammar instruction. University methods course, much to the chagrin of Dr. Zimmerman, also with a moderately small or a small to moderate positive relationship. World language textbook with a statistically strong relationship with the value of grammar instruction. And then we also see that sense of plausibility again, still with a small but nonetheless statistically significant relationship. On the flip side, we can look at these negative correlations. And what that negative correlation is telling us is that as a teacher says that the value of grammar instruction is not important, we'll see that the value of certain variables is actually increasing. And so this is important to identify what should we be introducing to our teachers. So for example, we see second language acquisition research. That's demonstrating a negative, a small to moderate negative correlation. We see the participation in online professional learning networks, a moderate, statistically significant negative correlation. We see formal world language professional development, also a moderate statistically significant negative correlation. And then that sense of self-efficacy also demonstrating a negative correlation. Now, when you look at the online professional learning networks, you look at the formal world language professional development, I wanted to take a look a little bit further on the idea of professional learning communities. And so what I did is, through the biodemographic information, I was able to establish how many professional learning communities these teachers are a part of. And so I just grouped them based on that number, 0 being none, 6 being all 6 that I presented as options. And what I was able to find through this analysis of variance is that the teachers who were less active in professional learning communities tended to perceive a higher value of explicit grammar instruction. And then also that the inverse there is also true. So that as teachers were involved in more professional learning communities, their value of explicit grammar instruction had a smaller statistically significant average. Again, really underscoring the importance of the professional learning communities that exist in our field. Now, one of the things when you look at these correlations that might also stand out as I think a potentially interesting finding is when you look at variable number 10, the assessment has no statistically significant correlation. The literature, certainly on the washback effect of assessment, would indicate that that shouldn't be the case. And so I wanted to hone in on that and understand that a little bit better as well. And so I conducted an ANOVA using assessment as well. So one of the information, one of the biodemographic pieces that I collected from the participants, I asked them, I said, what is the pedagogical focus of the assessments that you provide in your classroom? And I asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the focus is completely communicative, 10 being the focus is completely accuracy driven. And I broke them down then into 3 different groups, where anybody who rated like 1 through 3, I put them in a communicative assessment group. Anybody who rated 4 through 6, I put them in an eclectic group, meaning that there's some balance of the two. And then anywhere that was 7 through 10, I put them in an accuracy-based group. And what the ANOVA told me, with a large effect size, is that the influence of accuracy-based assessments, so anybody who was in group 2 or 3, tended to have a statistically significant higher mean score for the dependent variable than those that were in that communicative group. So while the correlation isn't there, this does demonstrate that assessment is in fact having some impact in terms of the value that we place on explicit grammar instruction in our practice. Because there's so many variables here, I thought that it would be prudent to also conduct a multiple regression analysis. This assesses the ability of these independent variables to predict the dependent variable score. It also allows for a clear understanding of how the relationships interplay in the context of all of these variables. The multiple regression analysis described 42.5% of the variance in this model, and it also identified 5 specific variables that emerged as significant, and I have them listed there by the strength of their beta score. So world language textbooks, again, coming out on top in terms of the strongest there. World language professional development with a negative beta score, online PLNs with another negative beta score, university method courses with a positive beta score, and then lastly, that sense of plausibility, again, with a small but positive beta score. So you take all of this information together, and leading into chapter 5, I wanted to synthesize all of these results. And one of the things that it really demonstrates, I think the picture that it paints for us, is that when you look at how language pedagogy develops over time, but then also transfers through generations. Again, I alluded to the fact that this has been going on for some 500 years at least. And so I developed this figure here that's called the cycle of pedagogical transference. Now, each of these phases, I think, have certain characteristics that this study helps to inform. And so we begin with that first phase, and that's the experiences as a learner. the fact is that the experiences that students have in the classroom are influential. The literature told us this, and this study underscores that. Now, when you couple that reality with what we know from Burke's observations, for example, about what's actually going on in these classrooms, we find a pretty problematic relationship between these two realities. And I also add that this phase one doesn't really exist in a vacuum. Teachers and students and society alike really bring in certain beliefs about the language learning process that also either informs or misinforms the process. You know, so a lot of, I talk for the idea of like media and marketing. You know, when you see these commercials for Rosetta Stone, for example, that can promise that you can learn a language overnight, I think that clouds our understanding of what really should be happening in a classroom setting. So you take all of that and you end up with some students that really enjoy the experience. They want to move on, and they want to move on to be a teacher themselves. And this phase two is another critical period where these are their experiences as a learner of language methodology. Now, when you look at what happens here, a teacher has to go through a very rigorous program in order to be credentialed. However, typically speaking, they really only spend about a single course that focuses on language-specific methodology. And within that course, there is a lot that needs to be discovered and unpacked. And only one aspect of that are these second language acquisition theories and principles. And so there's a really, I almost feel that this phase two is almost setting the university programs up to failure as they're currently aligned. Now, it's not just coursework though, and that's a critical piece here in this phase two. There are field observations, there are student teaching experiences as well, but again, there are researchers from the field that question perhaps the veracity of those experiences, or they question whether or not the teachers that are being observed, the cooperating teachers that are with the student teachers, are they properly vetted so that they can be highlighting and showcasing research-based practices. This then takes us into perhaps the longest period within this cycle of pedagogical transference, and this is the phase three. It is the longest in terms of time. It's perhaps the most important because this is where the teachers have the most autonomy to begin to kind of do their own thing in the classroom. But again, just like in phase one, this phase three does not exist in isolation, does not exist in a vacuum. And so we see the demands of the institution, demands of prescribed curriculum, these preconceived notions that we had discussed by teachers, by students, by colleagues, by administrators. And then we also see, for example, the omnipresence of textbooks, again, playing an influential role in this phase three. I also bring in this idea that teachers in this phase are oftentimes siloed in their practice. And so while collaboration might take place, I question, and this study also questions, whether or not that collaboration, so long as it's existing within that silo, is it challenging or is it disrupting pedagogical beliefs? The sense of plausibility in this phase three is obviously a factor as well. We saw that as one of the most influential factors overall. And that clearly creates almost a cycle of self-fulfilling and self-affirming practices that draw from all of these three phases together. Now, that's a bleak outlook. And so I also thought that this study, it helps describe a reactionary cycle. And this cycle is what I consider to be the disrupted cycle of pedagogical transference. And in this, what we're going to see are the same three phases. So phase one, just like before, phase two, just as we saw it before, and phase three, just as we saw it before. The difference here is that this study identifies a critical period within that phase three, and this is the disrupted phase. Now, the characteristics of this disruption of pedagogical beliefs, this is where we see elements like self-efficacy playing a role, increased self-efficacy, I should say, This is where we see second language acquisition research, but if not the research directly, indirectly, through a variety of materials that are informed by second language acquisition research. Online professional learning networks are playing a role here, and then also that formal professional development, all contributing in one form or another to disrupt that traditional pedagogical sense. And beyond that, so once we move beyond that into this phase 5, this is where true communicative language teaching is happening. And this is where language teachers and language students are truly self-actualizing in the classroom, because these are the experiences of an educator within this communicative sense, where the target language communication is being used to drive curriculum. The target language communication is making connections with people, with other disciplines. And the target language is being used to share ideas. Again, kind of going back to that like fundamental human innate ability that we have that connects us via language. Also in this phase 5, the students themselves, their perspectives, their worldviews, their values play a central role in the classroom to interpret the material, to evaluate the material, to react to it, and also, as I demonstrate in this phase, also to contribute to the curricular content. I identified two ways that that you could see this. One being in a storytelling method known as TPRS, where students are engaged with interesting stories that provide target language input, and even that has seen a shift from once teacher prescribed stories to now co-created stories, where I might have a framework of a story that I want to tell, but it is incomplete unless the students themselves contribute what they find interesting, what they find important, what they find funny. And so again, without the student and their perspective, the content is incomplete. Now, if storytelling isn't your thing, which it's not for a lot of language teachers, understandably so, I also provide a way that target language culture, where human beings can be the story, that's presented in the classroom. And I use through the image model, something that is now being used more and more in the field. And that lesson template within the image model, each one of those, it stands for an acronym, and that G in the image model stands for generating hypotheses. Or in other words, I can present cultural products, I can show them cultural practices. But the image model is incomplete unless I guide my students to generate hypotheses to understand the cultural perspectives that drive them. And so again, without the students being there to evaluate, to interpret, and to provide their own perspectives, the image model is incomplete, and the classroom is incomplete without the students being at the center. So I know that I'm approaching my allotted time here. So I want to just really quickly move into a really important facet of these findings, and that is the case for servant leadership in being the driving force of moving the paradigm shift in the field along. This study has two critical findings. World language teachers perceive other teachers to be influential. And as world language teachers engage with sources that provide a platform for these teachers, they are more likely to value communicative practices over accuracy-based practices. The common thread between these variables is teacher leadership. And so the more that we can provide platforms and opportunities for teachers to lead their colleagues, I think the further that we're going to push this paradigm shift along. Because of all of this information, I make certain recommendations. The first being is that building leaders, department leaders, curriculum leaders really should be structuring and prioritizing teacher-to-teacher collaboration. We see that mentorship opportunities are going to be critical here. And so not only just structuring and prioritizing collaboration, but really identifying quality instructors, identifying teachers that are utilizing research-based practices and leveraging them to be a part of that collaboration. I think that this study and the the implications that this study has in terms of the value of professional organizations is so obvious. And so encouraging membership in professional learning communities, both physical and virtual. And so, you know, I made the recommendation. I said, it shouldn't be taboo to allow teachers to be using their professional time to be engaging in these professional networks virtually, for example. And I fully recognize that the online professional learning networks have the potential to blur our personal and our professional selves. And that's one of the reasons why my recommendation is, well, we should then be prioritizing it during our professional time so that we can allow us to maintain that distance between those two compartmentalized sections of ourselves. The implications for this study, I think, again, are pretty obvious. The first is that any pre-experimental study really lends itself naturally to an actual experimental study. And certainly I identified 10 variables that all would be ripe for pre-test, post-test experimental designs, both qualitatively and quantitatively. I do think that there is a lot that could be discovered via a qualitative analysis within the same field. Also, one of the things that really stands out is how students are reacting to the pedagogical beliefs and the pedagogical practices of the teacher. And so how students experience, what the students' experiences are in a communicative language teaching setting, those that move beyond into that phase 2, how do they interact with the information that they're presented with, and how is it different than those that were in a non-communicative setting? How are teachers' disruptive beliefs impacting students' beliefs about the language acquisition process? I made the recommendation that students and teachers should be completely open about this process. I think that this will allow students to move beyond the classroom and take learning and acquisition in their own hands because they know how it works and they also know how it doesn't work. And so again, I think the implications for that research are very clear. And then lastly, the limitations for this study. I found it challenging, albeit I expected to find it challenging. Nonetheless, I found it challenging to infiltrate these teacher silos that I talked about. And that's one of the reasons why I extended the window to receive more participants. And while that window is extended, I went right for K through 12 teachers, and I went to their curriculum leaders and I said, hey, spread this out to your teachers, because I wanted to not focus so much on these professional learning communities that already exist. I wanted to find the teachers that aren't a part of them, and I found that hard to do. They are represented, but certainly not in the quantities of some of the other participants. I also acknowledge that there is perhaps a legitimate philosophical disagreement with the assumption that I make inherent in the dependent variable. There are those who would argue that just because you value grammar instruction, that does not mean that you value communication, or that it doesn't mean that you don't value communication. And I recognize that, and it's one of the things that I established early on. And I look to already investigate this when I took that dependent variable and I ran a correlation between that and that 1 to 10 scale. And I found that the dependent variable, the output of the dependent variable in this study, strongly positively correlated with a skew toward an accuracy-driven pedagogical focus. And so again, while I tried to account for it, I do think that legitimate pedagogical and philosophical critique is warranted. And then lastly, with any literature review, I think we have to recognize that the literature review is conducted by someone that has a specific view. And so I identified 10 potential variables. Dr. Zimmerman helped to make sure that I included assessment in there, which was a great contribution. And so it just goes to show you that any other keen researcher may be able to identify more or less variables from the research. And so when I look at the discussion in chapter 5, if I had more variables, if I had less variables, could I come to the same conclusion? I would like to say yes, but in the absence of identifying those variables, I can't say positively that that would be the case. So those, I think, are probably the most critical limitations. And that then leads me to the end of this.